How much does it matter in a story, whether it's a game or also other forms of media? But I'm gonna talk specifically, mostly when it comes to a game, because that's the media I consume the most nowadays. From my perspective, like because lately there have been quite a few games I have played or that have been announced or that have come out that are historical games. Let's say they take place in specific time, historical time periods. So like Kingdom Come, Ghost of Tsushima. Not too long ago they have announced Ghost of Yotei. Kingdom Come 2 came out not too long ago, so you get the gist. Like, how much does it matter? From my point of view, it depends mostly on how the game is sold, first and foremost. So, for example, in the case of Assassin's Creed Shadow, they they were trying to pass up like the fact that the Azuke was a samurai as a like historical fact, which is clearly not. The consultant they hired was accused of being a fraud, and he pretty much disappeared from the scene. So, and he was mostly the one who made it up, because there were no clear like proof. There was no clear proof that Yasuke was actually like a real samurai, just like any other else. The people who say otherwise are just coping. It's all speculation. Granted, it's probably mostly no than yes. But because if it was actually true, there would be more records of him actually being like a regular samurai, other than a glorified sword carrier, let's say, as opposed to other famous characters or personalities. Because, for example, William from Neo, he was an actual person that existed, and he was a samurai in that historical period. And there are actual records of him being a samurai, owning a house, having a wife in Japan, and so on. So that, even though Neo is not a like historical game because it's a fantasy game, that character actually was a samurai at one point in time. So if a Japanese studio wanted to make a game starring that person, I mean, whatever, it's their history. Plus, they are not making up anything. It's a fantasy game. But instead, with Assassin's Creed Shadows, as soon as they announced the game, people went to the Wikipedia for Yasuke, modify it so that you will actually say that he was indisputably a samurai, like it was a sure 100% fact, and they prevented other people from modifying the Wikipedia, which is that was all part of the agenda they were pushing, because you know how it works with media. Even if something is clearly not true, the more people repeat the lie, the more it's presented in the media, people will start to accept it as true. So, and that's not just with Yasuke, like with other things, it has happened with other things. Because even though, like, rationally we know that media, the stories portrayed in TV, in video games or whatever, are not real, people internalize those characters, those situations as real, especially if it's in the context of a specific historical period. So, like, There are countless movies, countless examples of this, and that's what they were trying to push with Yasuke. They were saying, yeah, he's a samurai, and nobody, so that nobody could say otherwise. But they got got caught lying and making shit up. But yeah, I mean, this was just the most egregious example. But if we're talking like about a game set, any other game set in a specific time period, in my opinion, it depends what they are trying to do. So if the dev team comes out and saying, yeah, we want to make a historically faithful game, so of course, if it ends up not being historically accurate, it comes to the game's detriment, in my opinion. Because the whole purpose, a big chunk of the purpose for the game to exist, comes short, and that's a problem. But even though if the devs don't say they're actually like trying to make a game that's historically accurate, if they come out with something that clearly doesn't fit the time period, it's gonna take you out of the experience. So, for example, in Ghost of Tsushima, there are quite a few female characters that are warriors, that are like actual sword-wielding warriors and so on. Which, I mean, historically, yes, there were a few women in Japan in that era that fought alongside men in their family, let's say. So it's not so much of a stretch in this case. Like, even though they were not fighting against the Mongols, from what I've read, they existed. So even if they are in Ghost of Tsushima, they weren't really in that like specific historical occasion. So you can say, well, it's fine, even though it's not 100% historical accurate. It's a stretch, but it can work. When it's stuff like this, I don't mind, honestly. Also because I understand if you're trying to portray something on the big screen or in a video game, you can't have just a sausage fest of all men. You have to have women as well. It just makes things, the overall setting, the story, and character relations much better and more interesting, as opposed to having only men. But I don't know. When it comes to stuff like Ghost of Yotei, I think it's already starting to be a stretch. Because a woman fighting alone like that, yeah, it's gonna... A woman fighting like Jin did in this game alone for the most part, taking on groups of enemies, yeah, it's gonna take me out of the experience. So I don't know about that one. Unless it's an even better game than Ghost of Tsushima, I don't know if I'm gonna play it. So, I mean, as long as it's something that's believable, if I turn off my suspension of disbelief even a little bit, it can work. I don't mind it that much. But the problem is when it comes to stuff like, I don't know, Kingdom Come 2, for example, where they put in wars they didn't even exist at the time. For example, like anti-Semitism wasn't really a thing back then. Like, nobody was accused of being an anti-Semite in the way the game is trying to tell you, for example, because there's a mission in that regard. I've seen there's a quest in the game in that regard, plus a bunch of other things. And I guess this comes, in my case, and comes out now because after years of consuming games, movies, whatever, any type of media, you start to question a few things. You start to ask yourself, yeah, this is this legit? The cracks start to show a lot of the time with these stories, like where you have woman, scrawny woman kicking men's asses all the time. For example, it's full of movies, not just historical movies, but also like movies in general, games in general, where this is the case. And I mean, if you're trying to portray a scenario that is somewhat realistic, that just takes me out of the experience, because you're not making a fantasy game. That's a different thing. Something like Ghost of Tsushima is not a fantasy game. It's a game that sells itself mostly on a somewhat believable realism, let's say. So if you start going too much into a certain direction, it takes me out of the experience. And it's the same thing for games that take place in a more modern time period, let's say. For example, I remember talking about this in my comment section with a person a few months ago about Metal Gear Solid 3, where you have Kojima, which in general seems to be like a very feminist-oriented person by the way he writes or talks about some of its female characters. Even though, I don't know, some portrays of his female characters are weird, but some you can clearly tell is on the feminist bandwagon. Like, for example, the boss in Metal Gear Solid 3. Like, he made a woman the mother of all special forces in World War II. And then in the 60s. Like, he made her so strong that she kicks even big boss's ass, let's say. And even Volgin is scared of her. But she's just a woman. So, like, back then, I don't know, everybody accepted that because there was no feminist movement resurgence, so we weren't really subjected to the constant propaganda, and also it was seen as quirky, as an anime type like of story, because Metal Gear is also a bit of anime, and in those types of stories you can have both strong men and strong woman, a very skilled woman. Plus, you can argue that even though there are pretty strong women in the Metal Gear series, the guys are always the protagonists for the most part. It's 99% of the time men are the final bosses in those games. The villains are men mostly. The protagonists are all men. So, but still there are a few portrayals of a very strong woman. So I think that's also why people were more willing to accept, are more willing to accept that. Because this year, the Metal Gear Solid 3 remake is coming out. Metal Gear Solid 3 Delta, I think, Snake Eater is called. And yeah, I don't know, it would be interesting to go back to that game now, in the current climate, with my current, I don't know, how do you want to say, with my current being jaded towards certain things. Because looking back on it, I think it's kind of dumb, honestly, that Kojima made the boss that strong. It's something that I have to turn my brain off nowadays to actually enjoy. So I will probably play the Metal Gear Solid 3 remake, but it will be interesting to see what I think about it. in the current climate, because it just feels wrong to have the boss do that stuff. Like you have to turn your brain off for that to feel somewhat believable. And yeah, you can say Metal Gear Solid has always blurred the lines of realism and fantasy. Yeah, sure. But I don't know. The boss was just a regular woman. She had no special powers like Quiet, so it was definitely an interesting portrayal by Kojima to make her that way. And no, I'm not gonna call Metal Gear Solid 3 woke, honestly, because you also have to contextualize when a product was made. And Metal Gear Solid 3 was made still when games were being made for gamers mostly, or at least people who played video games for the gameplay, sure, but also for the story. So like, you can't judge a product like that with today's sensibilities, let's say, with today's landscape. It just doesn't work. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on everything I said. Like, how much does it matter to you if a story in a game is historically accurate or somewhat realistic, somewhat like as long as there are no elements that take you out of the experience, or what are those elements, and let me know in the comments. Catch you soon, guys. Bye bye.